A roar splits the cold autumn air. It is deeper, older, and angrier than any sound a deer should be able to make. Through the thin birch trees, you finally see it, a stag the size of a horse. Its shoulders stand as high as a doorway, and above its head rises a crown of bone, so impossibly wide it seems to scrape the grey sky. Antlers spanning 12 feet from tip to tip, heavier than a small child. It swings that crown low, it roars again, and you are crouched in the wet grass, barely 15 paces away, gripping a thin wooden spear. This is not a fantasy. This is the rut of Megaloceros giganteus, the giant deer, the largest deer that ever walked the earth. Your ancestors knew this animal. They feared it, and more than 20,000 years ago, they painted it onto the walls of caves across Ice Age Europe. So be honest about your chances. The biggest males weighed as much as an Alaskan monstrous, close to 1,500 pounds of muscle. You cannot wrestle that. You cannot outrun it either. The giant deer was built like a sprinter, long-legged and fast across open ground, and those antlers are not just for show. In the rut, a stag will drive them through a rival with bone-cracking force. So how could a slow, clawless, weak-bodied human, armed with a sharpened stick, ever bring one of these giants down? The answer begins with the crown itself. For over a century, those antlers were science's favourite puzzle. The giant deer became the textbook example of a grim idea called orthogenesis, the belief that evolution could run away in a straight line until it killed a species. The story went that the antlers simply grew too big, that the stags got tangled in trees and drowned in bogs, doomed by their own heads. It was a tidy story. It was also wrong. In 1974, the biologist Stephen Jay Gould took the puzzle apart. By measuring skeleton after skeleton, he showed the antlers were not a mistake at all. They grew in near-perfect proportion to the animal's enormous body, exactly as you would expect. And they were a weapon of display, a billboard grown to win mates and stare down rivals. Gould even noticed the antlers were angled so cleverly that a stag could show off their full breadth simply by facing forward without turning its head. This was not a freak. This was a masterpiece of sexual selection. But a masterpiece comes at a brutal price, and that price is your opening. Every single year, a giant stag had to grow that entire 40-kilogram crown again from nothing. A staggering drain of calcium and minerals, pulled from its own skeleton and its food. By the peak of the autumn rut, after weeks of roaring, fasting and fighting, a big stag is utterly spent, exhausted, distracted, burning through the last of its reserves. It is, for a few short weeks, at its most dangerous and at its most vulnerable. That is when your ancestors moved. Picture the hunt, 5 of you, low in the reeds at the edge of a boggy meadow, downwind. You do not charge the stag. That is suicide. You wait for it to drift toward the soft, wet ground near the water, where its great weight and that towering crown turn from weapons into burdens. You spread wide. You let it commit. Then you drive it. Shouts, sudden movement, bodies rising where there were none. The panicked stag wheels and bolts, straight into the deep mud you chose for it. Now its long legs sink. Now those 12 feet of antler snag and sway, throwing it off balance, catching in the reeds, swinging like a sail in a storm. The very crown that made it a king has become an anchor, and now the sticks come out. From the flanks, beyond the reach of those flailing tines. Your darts fly, launched not from your bare arm, but from an atlatl, a simple throwing stick that whips a spear forward with far more speed than your muscles alone could ever give it. You do not aim for the skull, armoured beneath all that bone. You aim for the flank, just behind the shoulder, where a thrown point can slip between the ribs toward the lungs. One dart, then another, Then you do the hardest thing of all. You stop and you follow, because the final weapon is patience. A wounded giant cannot be rushed. So you track it, for an hour, for half a day, letting the blood, the exhaustion, and the merciless cold finish. The work no single spear ever could, until at last the great stag sinks into the mud it could not escape, and 5 small humans walk away with hundreds of pounds of meat, with hide, with sinew, and with antler, a material harder than wood, perfect for carving into the very tools that killed it. This was the reality across Ice Age Europe, from the painted caves of Cougnac and Chauvet to the wide cold plains of the East. For tens of thousands of years, your ancestors and the giant deer shared the same world, predator and prey, artist and muse. But here is the twist that history almost forgot. For Megaloceros giganteus, the deadliest hunter, was never you. The giant deer survived your ancestors. It outlasted them for thousands of years. The mammoths fell, the cave lions faded, and still the giant stags roamed the open land. Researchers like Adrian Lister, who has studied this animal for decades, traced what truly killed it, and it was not a spear, it was the weather. As the Ice Age finally released its grip, the climate lurched and warmed. The rich open grasslands gave way to dense forest, and the burst of spring growth a stag needed to rebuild that monstrous crown each year began to fail. An animal forced to find 40 kilograms of minerals every single year simply could not afford a warming world. The very last giant deer of all died not in Ireland, but on the cold plains of western Russia, around 7,700 years ago, long after the mammoths had gone from Europe and felled by no human hand at all. So listen again for that roar, splitting the cold autumn air, deeper and older than any deer should make. Picture the crown of bone scraping the sky, and the tiny figure crouched in the wet grass with nothing but a wooden stick. Your ancestors hunted this giant for 1,000 generations. But in the end, the greatest deer that ever lived was brought down not by the spear, but by the spring,